Okay. Well, hey everyone. My name is Joshua Jones, and I run the Sanity's Cove YouTube channel. So welcome back. And so this is a discussion slash interview I am having with Lachlan Vines. Now, let me introduce Lachlan. He is helping to lead up a church plant in Melbourne, Australia. So some of you will appreciate the Australian accent variety. I've had a lot of British guests on this channel before, and we've heard plenty of Irish and English, but this might be the first Australian accent we've had here. So really happy about that. The reason I've had Lachlan on, he's an Australian and he's involved in leadership within his local church. He recently came to America, actually to the North Midwest, spent some time there, had some reflections on sort of the social, political, what he's seen in the churches on the social political level, and posted a comment on Facebook that I thought was interesting. It was one of those I wanted to kind of poke a little bit about. I wasn't entirely sure. And I thought actually, instead of kind of going back and forth and maybe challenge his thinking or him challenge my thinking, wanted to just have him here for again a discussion slash interview to hear his thoughts and he's graciously allowed me to kind of ask his questions and maybe even challenge his thinking a little bit. So Lachlan, thank you for agreeing to come on. Sometimes I
Yeah.
engage with people online on Twitter or Facebook and I say, would you like to do a video online? And they kind of get scared and back off. But I thank you for being willing to come on here like this. And Lachlan, would you maybe just, I've given you a brief introduction, but would you introduce yourself and say what you were doing in America when you came and kind of what led you to formulate your thoughts and what you shared on
Mm.
Facebook there?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me, Josh. It's an honor to be your first Australian guest. So I was born and raised in Australia. Spent my whole life here. Traveled a bit. Never lived anywhere else, but I've traveled quite a bit around the world, and I've been to America a couple of times. Uh, for context, I should probably mention back in 2015, I spent about 3 months in the US and drove from LA to New York via the South, and that was quite an interesting cultural experience, very different to Australia. Um, and so more recently, a couple of months ago, just in July, I was in the US for a cycling trip with my dad, where we rode our bikes from Chicago to Minneapolis via Wisconsin. And so we spent a lot of time, it was about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, spent a lot of time well, cycling's an interesting way of seeing a country because the pace you go at means that you see things much in more detail than you would if you were driving,
Yeah.
and but you cover more ground than if you were walking. So we spent a lot of time in rural Midwest America, and um, and we would spend one night in a town and then ride to the next town, and yeah, and it was beautiful, great. I mean, lots of corn, beautiful
Yes.
cornfields,
A lot of
and
corn.
and it was a really interesting cultural experience for me. I mean, I loved the accent, first of all, and had some great conversations with people and could have just listened to them talk all day. But yeah, I was definitely struck by some, yeah, some of the intersection of religion and
Mhm.
particularly Christianity and politics, partly from watching, just watching local TV and news, and
Yeah.
partly from spending some time with some family friends who live in small town Wisconsin, and partly from, and largely actually just from even from seeing the signs that people put up out at the front of their houses. I think America's a very politically expressive country, more so than Australia, I think.
Yep.
So when people have their opinions, they make them known on their front yard, and
Yes.
also businesses would put their
Yeah.
opinions out front. And obviously, we're in post-Trump America, and so that was a big part of it. A lot of Trump support, and that was something that I uh, didn't actually understand the extent of that until actually being on the ground there and seeing what that looks like.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and but that's not really what I'm uh,
Mhm.
trying to talk about. But one thing was the conflation of that support of a particular
Mhm.
uh, political candidate, a particular presidential candidate, the conflation of that with religious faith, and sort of seeing them as very much going hand in hand,
Mhm.
and very much a part of, yeah, very much a part of their faith was
Mhm.
to be expressed in through a
Mhm.
political affiliation.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I wrote this post a couple of weeks ago, which I'd just been mulling over it, and so I'm studying theology full time at a college in Melbourne called Ridley College, which is an Anglican
Yeah.
evangelical college, and learned I studied early church history, which is really interesting, and just learning about Constantine
Mhm.
and the how religion and
Yeah.
the state related back then. And one thing that I'd sort of just realized is that actually Christian nationalism really is just human nature. I think so back in empire times and monarchical times, if a king adopted the worship of a new god, so did the whole kingdom. That was just
Mhm.
the assumption. And so when that, when Constantine, and as I mentioned in the post, Constantine wasn't even the first one to do this. It was
Mhm.
probably, it seems that the kingdom of Edessa, 100 years earlier, was the first
Mhm.
Christian state. And
Did
um,
Edessa come before Armenia?
Yes,
Armenia?
it seems to have,
Okay.
and yeah, and as I mentioned on one of
Yeah.
your posts, there's a bit of confusion there about that.
Sure.
But my Christian history textbook, which I'll trust over
Yeah.
Wikipedia, tells me that
Sure.
Edessa. But so all of that just shows that
Yeah.
this was just the assumption. This is
Yeah.
there was a natural tendency to just bring the two together, and I
Yeah.
think Christianity has a built-in resistance to that that people didn't it was too ingrained for people to get that at first.
Mhm.
And so what I noticed in the US is that I think there is a the same human nature is at
Mhm.
play here in wanting to bring state and faith
Mhm.
together,
Yeah.
but it expresses in a different way because it's a democracy,
Mhm.
and so uh, and that's just a fundamentally different political system to
Mhm.
monarchy,
Mhm.
and but in both cases, I think. So, in the case of America, it seems to me that a lot of Christians want to use the mechanisms of state, so
Mhm.
in this case, the mechanisms of
Yeah.
democracy to achieve Christian power in
Mhm.
the land.
Mhm.
And that's the mechanisms are different because in under monarchy, you would do that by getting a Christian on the throne, either
Mhm.
by conversion or by revolution. That
Mhm.
would be how you would do it. But
Yeah.
in a democracy, the way to get a Christian on the throne
Mhm.
is to vote,
Yeah.
because as there's the saying that in democracy we have a peaceful revolution every 3 or 4 years, depending on
Yeah.
your country, where we overthrow the government,
Yeah.
as called an election,
Yeah.
and so the mechanism for that is peaceful.
Mhm.
Um, but so and so one of the points I was trying to make is that uh, Christian nationalism can come in many forms,
Mhm.
basically, and so the most obvious form of it is in something like monarchy, where
So,
essentially.
if excuse you, Lachlan, I don't want to interrupt you, but you've
Sure,
used the term a few times now, Christian nationalism.
sure.
I hear that term thrown a lot on social media, and I've even asked people what their definition is, and I usually get all sorts of different responses. So, would you
Yeah.
mind just maybe giving a little definition or help us understand what you mean when you use that term?
Yeah, sure. And to be fair, I think it is a term. It's a term that can be elusive in its definition. It can be hard to define, and I think it's partly because it it can manifest in multiple different ways, and it can mean different things. And so I think I would understand Christian nationalism to mean uh, an ideology or a viewpoint that wants to uh, that wants there to be a sort of state or national adherence to Christianity as the predominant
Hmm.
worldview or uh, the predominant ideology of the land.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, so the most obvious form of that would be to attempt to have an official Christian state
Hmm.
where you know the 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 legislative or the
Yeah.
constitutional thing is that our country is Christian. Um,
And so when you talk about this, are you referring to, many of the states that we've seen throughout history, from Odessia, Armenia, through so much of European history, where France or Britain or Spain or Italy, these were sort of officially they were Christian, with a Christian
mm,
ruler and laws based on Christian ethics. And yes, in many of those countries, there were Jewish minorities, and there are some people
yeah,
maybe of different faiths and some pagan enclaves, but still the predominant ethos of the land and the ruler
mm,
and the system of law kind of came from a Christian or a biblical ethic.
mm.
Am I
Yes.
okay?
Uh, yeah. So yes, um, that is those are the sort of types of
Mhm.
states I'm referring to, um, and but so I think part of the issue is, and it's part of the point that I am making in the post, is that it can be more subtle than that. It can be more. It can use the mechanisms of state in a different way than those states where it was an established church,
Hmm.
right, where the king was the head of the church
Yeah.
maybe, and all of this, and whereas in in the US it seems to me that for many people what they want is not, they don't want necessarily a constitutionally enshrined or a legislatively enshrined Christianity
Mhm.
as the, so you could make the distinction between de jure and de facto, if
Okay.
you know those words.
Hmm.
Where like, so I think many Americans, they don't want, they want separation of church and state in on paper basically, uh,
You mean they don't want like a
but
state church, like in England,
yeah, they don't want a
the
state
Church of
church. Yeah,
England, and even in
yeah, exactly.
Australia, being part of the Commonwealth, the Anglican
Yeah,
Church in some ways is,
yeah.
the Queen is the head still.
It's definitely complicated in Australia, but
Yeah.
yes. And so I think Americans, they're not looking for that from what I see. That's and when I say Americans, I mean some, not all.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't
And
know too
also,
many American Christians who want a church run by the government.
yeah, exact. Oh, yeah, definitely not.
We don't
Right.
have a good opinion of government running
Yeah.
things here. So the
And you
idea of the
could
government
say,
running a church seems like
yeah.
a
And
bad
so
idea.
to use that language, you might say that what they do want is a government run by the church.
Okay.
And so I think what it looks like to me is many people want, essentially they want Christianity to be culturally dominant,
Hmm.
and for
Yeah.
Christianity to have a sort of a sufficient number of people, a
Hmm.
sufficient number of adherents that they're able to influence policy and influence, probably vote for Christian presidents and government people, and influence the law in such a way as to, um, I would put it as impose
Hmm.
Christianity on the people. And so I'd make the distinction between Christian nationalism by the tyranny of the king
Hmm.
versus Christian nationalism by the tyranny of the majority.
Okay.
Um, and and I it's and basically, yeah, I don't think that is how. So I think that many Christians, particularly in America and also other countries, it's here in Australia as well, think that because the democratic mechanism is peaceful,
Hmm.
and so because the way that Christianity could attain power in the land is peaceful because it's non-violent, it's voting.
Hmm.
Um, because of that, therefore, Christian imposition on the land is legitimate
Hmm.
because it's non-violent. But part of the what's common to all governments, no matter what system of government it is that the way regardless of how a government establishes its power and
Hmm.
attains power, all governments are essentially coercive. They
Hmm.
have to be. It's a good thing that they are. That's how we prevent
Yeah.
people from murdering each other.
Yeah.
Um, but they think that because the democratic mechanism for attaining power
Yeah.
is peaceful, they think that the exercise of Christian power in the state through that means
Hmm.
is legitimate,
Yeah.
and I think that's wrong.
Okay.
I think that's not how Jesus wants to extend his rule in the
Sure.
earth.
All right, thank you very much for fleshing all that out for us, Lachlan. So, I can
Mm,
imagine someone who maybe identifies themselves, whether maybe as a Christian nationalist, responding and saying, "Well, wait a minute, isn't this the goal of the church to fill the nations? Isn't this
mm,
the goal to influence society? There how." How should a country that is majority Christian act in a democracy?
mm,
You talk
yep.
about imposing Christian ethics, but doesn't
Mm,
all government everywhere impose by its nature? Government
yes,
imposes its laws by police and by force. We have to obey the law. I
definitely.
have to obey the speed limit. I have to pay my taxes. I have to,
Yep.
resident or a citizen of a certain country, and that government is going to have to base its laws from some form of ethics and some form of worldview. So if the laws aren't coming from a sort of Christian ethos,
Mm,
should we want there to be a pagan ethos driving our laws? Is it wrong to want to have a Christian worldview from which our laws come? And of course, they're enforced
mm,
because you know laws by their very nature are enforced. They're not suggestive. You know,
yep.
um, so how would you push back to say, listen, all laws will be enforced, but why not have them rooted in Christian ethics instead of pagan ethics?
Yes. And that's a really important question. So thank you for asking for that clarification uh, because I agree. So I think Christians should seek to influence the law. So I'm not intending to say that they shouldn't. Um, and so one distinction I try to make in the post is a distinction between us seeking Christian ethics as opposed to seeking Christian allegiance in the land. So there's a difference between uh, seeking to influence laws such that the 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 laws of the land reflect Christian values of what justice is. I think that's a good goal that we should have. It's another thing to seek to influence the laws of the land such that as a geographical community, the land would have Christian allegiance. So that seeking that the nation would at the populace level uh, call Yahweh its king, right? It seems to me that many people they want more than just laws that uh, bring justice to the land, but they actually um, want the nation to say, "In God we trust." Right.
So for an example, for many, maybe people are watching this, just last week, the most watched televised program ever, at least the people say up to 3 billion
Oh, yeah.
people watched
Mm,
the Queen's funeral. It sounds like the way you're describing it, this official proclaiming Jesus as King of Kings. I actually thought, at least from my understanding of the term, that the whole show was a profound display of what people nowadays are calling Christian nationalism. The head of
I
state
agree.
was laying
Yeah.
right there, and
Yeah.
it was, here is our Queen's faith. She believes Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and all
Mm,
this is paid for by taxpayer money, and this whole funeral and event,
yeah.
and scripture was being read. Um, and, the Queen, the head of the, not only England, but the Commonwealth,
Yeah.
for Australia, for Canada, for so many other places around the world. The Queen was in through her funeral, which, from what I understand, she had a big part in planning her own funeral.
Right.
She picked out a lot of the Psalms and things that were to be read. It was good scripture being read. Now, I don't know, because many of the people doing the readings and things were politicians. I don't actually know if those politicians doing the readings actually shared the Queen's faith. So them
Yeah.
getting up reading scripture, I'm not sure if those politicians reading it had faith, but it seemed like the Queen had a genuine Christian faith, and therefore
Mm,
she wanted the Commonwealth to recognize the fact that Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Do you think it's a problem for an earthly government to formally acknowledge, hey, we're just human, but there's a power greater than us, and we can never think that we are God? We have to recognize
mm,
that there is a God above us, and we rulers, whether we're a Senate or a parliament or a president or a prime minister, one day we will have to give an account, and so we should govern in the fear of the Lord. That's not the same as
mm,
trying to force people to be Christians, but it's the same as saying, hey, government has an authority above it, and we shouldn't get
mm.
too, high on our horse.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point, and on one level, I do uh, really love the sentiment of it. I love the sentiment of people in government acknowledging, maybe even publicly, that they are not the top dog in the universe. Um, and and I think it's complicated because, yeah, while I appreciate that sentiment, I think it can come along with unhelpful consequences. So so one of them is, in what way do they represent the people that of the nation? So I mean, yeah, it's a very complicated thing, because in England is just its own thing, where the queen, the monarch, is literally considered to be the representative of God in the nation, and that's, to me, that's quite a strange idea.
Yeah.
Um, and but I think the problem can be that it's it it makes for a land where Christianity is the status quo, and
Mhm.
Christianity is this prevailing ideology where people who are, and that's interesting, especially like in England, where Christianity is actually a minority.
Mhm. Yeah.
Most people actually don't embrace it, and
No,
so
I can
there's
testify. That's definitely
yeah,
true.
yeah. And there's all sorts. I mean, yesterday I was listening on the radio to our Australian ceremony. Now that our Prime Minister's come back to Australia, we had a public day of mourning, and they had a ceremony where multiple political leaders got up and read prayers, and I thought, well, that's, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe that all of them happen to be Christian, but I just thought of the hypocrisy of that. Some people would think that, I mean, there's the hypocrisy of the individual not being a Christian and reading a prayer, but I'm more concerned with the hypocrisy of Christian leaders being happy with that, being
Yeah.
happy with a non-Christian.
So,
Uh, mm,
Lachlan, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm just going to interject a little more than I have been
yeah.
maybe. So, a couple of things. One, you mentioned just a minute ago, you have some concerns about Christianity being the status quo. Now,
Mm,
someone could respond, well, something has to be the status quo. There is no
yep.
vacuum. There is no
Mm,
philosophical neutrality. If it's not Christianity, it's a militant secularism or a paganism. Do we really want our neighbors and our communities, growing up in an environment where paganism is the status quo or a godless secularism? I mean, well, why not? A Christianity is the status quo. What I think I hear you saying, and what maybe you were referring to back with your comments on Constantine, is that, when Christianity becomes a dominant ideology, it opens up the door for a lot of hypocrisy. People proclaiming their allegiance to Christ, or, quote, like, at the Queen's funeral, maybe reading scripture and different things, when the people actually have no genuine faith. They're doing it just
mm.
ceremony or to maybe obtain some position of power. Would that be, however Christianity becomes the dominant ideology, whether it's because the king or queen embraced Christianity or it's the dominant prevailing culture in a democracy, so, laws from a Christian ethos are getting voted in. Is it the fact that when Christian becomes dominant, it just opens up the door for people to kind of fake a Christian faith just for the sake of influence? Is
I
that your
think
primary
I
concern
think
with this?
it's definitely a concern. I actually wouldn't say it's my primary concern, but
Okay.
it's definitely a concern. I think, and one because we are low on time. One thing I should just point out that there is a difference in this whole discussion between the question of what's good for a nation, what's good for a state, and the other question of what's good for the church.
Okay.
And what should the church's goals and methods be?
Mhm.
So I think there's a potentially more complex question of what's the best way for a state to run? What worldview should it embrace officially, and all of these things? And I have views on that. But what I'm more concerned about, more passionate about, is that the church's goal should not be to use political means to expand God's kingdom.
Do you
I don't think
feel,
that is.
when you say
Sorry.
expand God's kingdom, do you have a concern that some people are somehow using political power to kind of force people to be Christians? Do you see
I
that
think
happening somewhere? Like if they're in power, they're going to say, okay, you guys have to become Christians now, or have
hmm,
you come across that? I'm not sure I have
I
behind
think
that.
yeah, that's fair. It's very nuanced. I think what's well, so one thing is maybe not so much trying to get people to become Christian, but trying to uh, attain Christian privilege in the nation. And so that's one of the problems that I think is there.
Okay.
As in the name of religious freedom,
Mhm.
we pursue religious privilege, which is
Mhm.
actually making Christians into a privileged
Okay.
class in a disproportionate way.
Yeah.
Uh, and and I think there is the I do think that there are people who want to use who want to, as I said, who want the the nation as a whole to say, "In God we trust." I think
Mhm.
that is a real thing,
Mhm.
um, and I think there's also there's a an important and complex question about the way that the church pursues justice in the land and pursues Christian ethics in the land, and yeah, we probably don't have time to go into it,
So
but
we
the,
are out of time now. You're
mm,
raising even more good questions. It would be great if this conversation was a bit longer, but we have to come
mm.
to an end. Lachlan, thank you very much for coming on. And I'm just going to go ahead and hit the stop recording button.